Hi, this is Everett, Everett's Watercolors. Welcome to my studios. This is Simply Drawing with Everett tonight at 7:30 p.m. Here I am, live, ready to go. I'm broadcasting live from my studio to YouTube, LinkedIn, Facebook, Twitch, and later on to Instagram. I'm in my studio tonight with my wife, Gloria.
Hello.
She'll be monitoring the broadcast and also the chat room. The chat room's live, so if you got a question or comment during the broadcast, give me a comment. I'll get back to you as soon as I can. And even after the broadcast, there's a comment section in the description below. Give me a comment, a question. I'll get back to you as soon as possible. Now tonight I'm going to do a drawing, of course, and let me go back. Let's go to my drawing table and let me get started on my description. Overhead camera. Okay, tonight I'm going to do a drawing of a pine cone. Now this is the pine cone season. They've been out there and pick up a pine cone. Now what I'm going to do, there's a couple of things that I want to point out here. You can see I've got several of them here. I'm going to use this one over here with my hand touching. That's the one I'm going to use as my model to draw from. These two here are just a couple extra ones to so I can look at. Now if you look at it, if you look at the configuration here, if you look at a study very carefully, you'll see that the rows on the pine cone are not symmetrical. In other words, you'll see an overlapping row. This row here is here, and the second one is got the inner space between the next line. So they alternate the spaces between lines. So that's one thing to think about. And also the shape of the end here has got a little point to it. Okay, and then there's of course there's a shadow part here in between. And so what I've done here, let me just describe that to you a little bit. But here's the best way to look at it. Think of the pine needles here, or the part of the pine cone, as a matrix. It's got these curves, and they both go longitudinal along the length of the pine cone, and they go across the transverse side. And then what I do is here, I'm going to draw in each one of these, and I overlap the second row, and so forth and so on. So I've gone ahead and done some preliminary marks, because that takes a little while to get all those in. So I did a couple marks here on this piece of paper. So what I'm going to draw on, but I'm going to start out here, and I'm going to start out here at the top. And I'm going to start, and instead of the pencil, I'm going to go ahead and put these, I'm going to darken these in with my fountain pen. This is a fountain pen with permanent ink in, okay? So I want to use the draw on. So let me get started here. I'm going to go ahead and darken the lines in that I've started. And this will be easier to see the shape and also see the form of the pine cone. These little points come out. We'll talk about that some more here as I get further down. And then the second row, or the next row next to it, is overlapping in between. So the rows of parts of the pine cone are interwoven. And if you think of that matrix I showed you, they form a pattern of overweaving shapes. You'll see it right here as I start this row here. Keep the point. You see the row, this one here is in between the row above. So they overlap. This one here goes in between. So as you get started, you get a pattern going here. And then it's pretty easy to find. If you use that grid I showed you in the beginning, draw a grid, and then use that as a guideline to fill in the space and the shape, and then it'll start looking like the pine cone if you get down to that point there. And I think as we go on here, you'll start seeing this take shape. This time of year, I always go out when I'm walking and I'll find a pine cone on the ground, and I love to draw the shapes of the pine cone, and I do several small paintings once in a while. Now it is a little challenge to get started on this, but once you get started and understand the shape, and this is the thing about drawing, you want to study the shape that you're drawing, analyze it, and find out which is the simplest way or the best way to describe that shape. Okay, you see there the rows here, and there's the one the next row they interweave. So I started out with a little bit of a beginning here. I started in the beginning with a little quick. I made some line marks to give myself a good reference here, so it wouldn't take so long to draw each one. And then I thought I would show the results here of my sketching. And the other thing is you can also use a little artist license on the shapes. You can they don't have to be perfect, but they ought to have a similar pattern. You look for a pattern, you look for a design, you look for an element that you can draw that makes sense and still describes the subject matter. Now we're coming down toward the front of the pine cone. Of course, it gets a little more narrower down here, so there's less of these shapes as we come forward down to the tip here. And every pine cone you find will have a slightly different, but they all have the same sort of characteristic. But they're not the same. There's always a little difference between each one of the pine cones you'll find. But you'll find a lot of similarities. We come down here to the end, there's a little, it turns over toward the bottom, and it flattens out. There's a little flat side here at the bottom. It flares out. Okay. Now that pretty well, it doesn't define exactly the one I have here, but it shows the similarities of the shapes. Similarities of the shapes. And I think what I'll do is I want to put one more over here to balance this out a little bit over here. Yeah, kind of get that one in. Okay, and I'm going to draw a kind of a horizontal line here to kind of shape in some. This might be a tree or something on the ground. So I'll put some more elements here in the design. Okay, all right. That is the basic shape. Now we're going to put in some shading to give it a little more depth. I'm going to use a 4B pencil here. Now I'm going to do some shading, and I'll start on the inside here. Now this will give the pine cone a little shape. And I'm going to shade in each one of these areas, but you don't shade them in the whole way. Just shade in enough to get a shape on there. So notice all you see it when you look at a pine cone, you see the end points of each one of these shapes, but then it goes into shadow very quickly toward the center of the pine cone. So this shading is very important. This shows the depth of each one of the shapes or parts of the pine cone. So as I shade this in, you'll start seeing the shape show up. by shading in this area right here, the pine cone starts to take on a little bit of more definition. And I'll bring that up. I'll bring it up closer to the camera. You can see there. As I get closer, you can see now I've shaded in half of it, so I'm going to keep on going. But I'll continue on shading in that part of the. I don't know what you call these things. They're part of the pine cone. I don't know all the parts. But these are the little points that are inside the pine cone. And they're very sharp. They prick your finger when you pick them up. I've done that several times. But once you've picked them up enough of them, you get used to that and get prepared. You might wear a pair of gloves when you pick up a pine cone sometimes, because this little point is very sharp. The little points into these little sections. It might be a self-defense thing from nature. Nature has its own way of defending itself. Okay, now I'm going to take the blender and put a little more shading in there. Take the blender. This is the blender stump. So I'll go in there and put a little more shading here on these sections, and then we'll start seeing the shapes starting to pop out. So that's why it took a little extra time I started a little preliminary. I did some drawing, a little bit of drawing just to get started on the shapes, so I could fill it in quicker. As a demonstration, this is how you would draw a pine cone. Shading in some more. Now you can start seeing it really starting to come alive now. Start seeing the dimensions of the pine cone. Shading is always a very important part of drawing. It gives depth to a subject. I'll bring it up a little bit closer. Now you can see the shape of the pine cone with those on. And what I'll do, I'll take that 2B pencil. Now I'm going to put a little shadow pattern here in the background. Now the sun's out a little bit, so we'll put a little shadow over here that the sun is shining against the pine cone. It'll define some of these edges out here a little better. Do shade around the outside edge, just this one section here. So this is like a cast shadow against could be a tree or a building or something that's lying on the ground, casting a shadow up against another surface. Using the side of the pencil when I shade in, because that way you don't wear your lead down as quick as you would if you use the point. So use the side of the lead to shade in. Now I'll take the blender now, and the blender smooths out those pencil marks. When you do the shading, you'll leave lines, and then you take the blender to smooth out those lines and give it a solid shape. So that ends that, and I'll put a little shading around the outside of this shape up here to define the top edge a little better. This might be a tree stump or something that's growing up behind the pine cone. But right now we're just casting a little shadow against it. and make some lines here to kind of give it a little character, a little definition. It's just could be a tree trunk or something here next to the pine cone. Give it a little definition, also a little interest. And then I'll come down here around the side here, and I'll show area down here around the. Now this area down here would be in shadow around the bottom of the pine cone. It's sitting on the ground, so we'll have it sitting on the ground. So we'll have a little shadow pattern at the bottom, and that also define the edges of the pine cone. Okay, then I'm going to use the blender now to smooth out some of those marks, especially concentrating around the edges here. Most important part of the drawing is around the edges of the pine cone. And the shadow pattern here at the bottom. Okay, I'll bring it up to you to see that. You can see now. You can see that now. You can really see the definition of the pine cone with the shadow pattern. And you know what I may do? I may go in. I got a little more time. I may go in here and put a little more. I'm going to just define these shadows just a little more on the form on some of these. Not all of them, just a few. Get a little more definition. These can be darker. So I'm adding a little more definition here on some of these shapes inside the pine cone. A little darker mark. Okay, and then I'll use the blender, darken it up even, smooth out those marks just a little bit. You're almost finished now with this one. Okay, and the last thing I want to do is also I'm going to put some pine needles down here on the ground. So all they're just going to be little strings, little marks on the ground. When you have a pine tree, you're going to have a pine cone, and you're going to have pine needles on the ground. These are just long marks along the edge of the drawing here to give a little more definition, a little more identity, a little more character. Okay, making some long lines. These are pine needles lying on the ground next to the pine cone. A little bark on that tree. This shadow over here can be a little bit darker along here because it's really that cast shadow should be a little darker along the edge. Little variety, little variation in the shadow pattern. A little shading down here in the pine needles. They're going to have a shadow also. Okay, so let's review what we've done here, how we drew this. We started out with the shape of the pine cone. My drawing, when I started, I was referencing here. There's the basic shape of the pine cone. It's got a wide base, then it comes down to a narrow front. So this is the bottom, this is the top. if you stood a pine cone up, it looked like something like that. Okay, I'm looking at it from the side. You're looking at it from the top. The camera pointing down, but if you look at it from the side, you got the bottom here is flatter, round, wider, and it got narrow at the top. Well, that's the shape of the pine cone right here. And then what I did was I was talking about the pattern of the needle of the internal section there, and you'll notice that when you look at those, I got to bring up next to the camera. They overlap. You can, if I turn this around different directions, you can see that interweaving of those. You can see those points. They're very sharp. My hand right now, I'm pointing at each one of them, are very sharp. But each row, you can see this line right here. There's a line that goes across this way at an angle. They're not straight across, but they overlap. Very interesting design in nature. Very interesting. Okay. So what if you draw this element here of get these, and then you go in and you make a point here, and then make sure you interweave. So if you start in this section here with a point, then the one underneath that is going to start here. That way you get. If you look at this diagram, if you start at this point up here, then the second row is going to start to the left of that. So they're going to interweave each other. Here, this is going to move over a section, so it's going to interweave. And that's how you come up with that design of the pine cone. There's a snapshot. There's a snapshot of the drawing. You got a real nice close-up. You can see how I drew that. And the shading. And I'll give you, let's do a close-up of this one. There's a close-up of this. That's kind of the matrix or the outline of the pine cone. That's where you would start, something like that. And then interweave your sections of each row gets moved down. It interweaves with the next line and so forth until you get down to the bottom. Okay. And then the shading part. The shading part, I left the point tip here. I left that white, and I just shaded the part that's down to the bottom of the second. So that way you give a little highlight. The top edge is light, and then you go down to the bottom where it's dark. And that's just like when you look at this, the same thing here. You only see the points. When you look at a pine cone, you don't see the whole thing. You just see the points. The rest is in shadow. The rest is in shadow. Okay, so that's what I was trying to depict here. I was trying to show here that you would shade in the bottom section. Just leave the point showing right here. Okay. Okay. Well, let's go to my main camera. Okay. Well, that finishes up my drawing tonight of the pine cone. And I hope you like that. Give me a thumbs up and a like. It helps in my rating very much. And I really appreciate that. I'll be back again next week at 7:30 p.m. with another drawing exercise. I don't know what it'll be right now. I'll be thinking about as I go out and walk around and see things. I may find something to draw outside, or I may draw something inside. I haven't decided yet. But you come back next week and you'll find out. So if you're subscribed to this channel, you'll be notified of my next live video. I'll also be here on Thursday afternoon at 2:00 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. And on the weekends I do, on Sundays I put out a little drawing called Anyone Can Draw with One Line. And that's very popular. I think you might enjoy that. If you want to draw the pine cone and use those close-ups I showed you of how to draw it, you can post them on my Facebook page, Everett's Watercolors Art Group. Everett's Watercolors Art Group on Facebook. Okay, so I hope and share that with the group there. I'd be glad to. I'd like to see you join that and share your accomplishment. Okay, until next week, you all stay safe, and I'll see